Hi, welcome to our session, Environmental Justice is Economic Justice, as part of Florida Climate Week. Today, we will be discussing the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and how it connects to the ideas of economic justice and a just transition. But first, I would like to thank the FOLO Foundation for hosting us as part of Florida Climate Week. I'm Teresa Pinto. I'm a staff attorney with the P.E.E.R group based in Miami. We call ourselves your neighborhood nonprofit law firm, and we work generally on resilience, sustainability, and sociological equity in the greater Miami area. With me are Joanne Peredin, the Senior Director of Climate Equity at the CLEO Institute. She's also been appointed to the White House Environmental Justice Council, and she's also a PhD candidate in public affairs at FIU School of International and Public Affairs. We also have Sam Chesser with us. He is the South Florida Vice President of Self-Help. And with that, I'll pass it to Joanne to discuss environmental justice and the intersections with climate and economic justice.
Thank you, Teresa. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be sharing this space with Teresa and Sam. And my goal is to go over building a social justice framework and what it means when we're talking about climate justice, environmental justice, and economic justice, and what are some of the implications that we should be thinking about in terms of when we ask ourselves what are some solutions or what are some next steps that we should be thinking about moving forward. Next slide, please. So the agenda that I have prepared today is to share with you a little bit about the organization. Then we'll transition into defining some key terms that oftentimes are interchangeably used, but in reality, they are somewhat different. Then we'll dive into the importance and the interconnections of climate justice, environmental justice, and economic justice. Then we'll explore some examples in terms of some of the challenges that we are seeing today and some strategies that we can explore moving forward. So the CLEO Institute is a nonprofit organization headquartered in Miami, Florida, and we do have physical presence across the states, such as Central Florida, in the greater Tampa Bay region, and in Tallahassee. And our goal is to educate and empower communities so that we can demand climate action and ensure that we have a safe, just and healthy environment for all, especially when we think about future generations. And to understand the different spaces in which we engage, so how do we push for or promote climate education and advocacy is through education, engagement with different partner groups, advocacy, partnership, and collaboration. And some of the issues that we focus on, or the areas that we work in, include policy, education, and movement building. And the different spaces in which we are addressing those issues or advocating for those issues are through partnerships and at the local level, state level, national, and international. So for example, we engage with academic institutions, local government, nonprofit organization, community-based and grassroots organization, among others. And examples of programs, specific programs or flagship programs that we run addressing some of those different areas that I have shared with you so far are our CLEO Speakers Network. So we train individuals who are interested in learning more about the driving forces behind the climate crisis and some of the actions that can be taken to advocate for climate solutions. We also work with specific groups such as youth group, college chapters, school teachers, and any other stakeholder groups interested in learning about climate change and also wanting to be climate advocate. Next slide. So the theme of today's presentation is on environmental justice and economic justice, but I think we need to take a step back when it comes to those different terms related to justice issues. So first, I think it's really crucial that we understand what we mean by justice, specifically what we mean by social justice when there are conversations around justice issues. So I invite you to think about social justice as a systemic approach for addressing how different communities or groups have not been treated fairly, but there's a push for having systemic changes to create um, an equal, equitable, just, and fair environment. So this is more of a high level approach for promoting issues around justice and equity. Next slide. And now let's say if we were looking at social justice as the roots of a tree, and now this tree is growing and creating or developing branches. One of those branches is climate justice. So what climate justice highlights or promotes is that when we look at how the impact of climate change is affecting different communities, those impacts are not equal. And one example is uh, if we look at hurricanes, for example, what's contributing to hurricanes being more devastating or happening a little bit more frequently, it's because of our changing climate. However, when we look at how different communities are able to prepare for and recover from hurricanes, disability or those resources that would allow communities to prepare and reduce their risk from hurricane impact are not the same. So when we talk about climate justice is how do we address those disproportional impacts on different communities and how do we change those systemic inequalities. Next slide. So here I want to show an example. So when we talk about what are some of the factors contributing to climate change, one common factor is human activities. And one specific example is greenhouse gases. So those are gases like nitrogen oxide, carbon dioxide, which are heat trapping gas, contributing to the increase in temperature on our planet, and as a result, fueling events such as hurricane. But when we look at which country contribute the most to the emission of greenhouse gases, the circles to the left of the screen are the countries that release the highest emission of greenhouse gases. So we have countries like China, the US, European Union, and India. But when we look at the red circles to the right, those are looking at the emission contributed by individuals within a country level. So we are seeing a shift in terms of the distribution of emission release. So what that means is as individuals, we should be asking ourselves, what impact are we having on, on the driving factors of climate change? So this is looking at emission release. But if we're looking at who, in terms of countries, are affected by events like hurricanes, 8 out of 15 of the countries that are the most vulnerable to weather-related events are in South America and the Caribbean. And if we're looking at those circles that I have, whether it be the ones on the left or the one to the right, the only countries that are coming up are Brazil and Mexico. So that speaks to the disproportionality in terms of who's impacted the hardest by greenhouse gas emission and their contribution to the acceleration of our changing climate. Next slide, please. And the next, so we've talked about the root of that tree, which is social justice. We've talked about one branch, which is climate justice. And now we're going to dive into environmental justice. So environmental justice can be a little bit more local in terms of context, but there is some overlap with climate and the environment. Of course, the climate is looking at change over time, but with the environment, we're looking at things that are most likely in your backyard that are contributing to the safety or unsafe environment that you're surrounded by. So for example, here with this image, we do have a site that is probably dealing with toxic materials, but also releasing fumes right next to a residential neighborhood. So what that means, people living in areas such as the one in this picture are exposed to contaminants that could have severe impact on their health. And some of those impacts could be increase in asthma exacerbation. It could be triggering seizures, or it could also contribute to an increase in cancer cases, something that is pretty common in Cancer Alley in places such as Louisiana. So when we talk about environmental justice, what we mean by that is we are addressing social and ethical issues with regards to the state of our environment. And we're also advocating for the fair treatment of all people, regardless of race, income, culture, belief, and others. Next slide. So one example here is regarding an incident down here in South Florida. There's a community called Doral, which is in Miami-Dade County, and that community had an incinerator which caught fire, and that incinerator was Covanta. But in that neighborhood, there's also a landfill where waste is being dumped. But the fire incident did create a lot of concern. It also received a lot of media attention. However, there has been so many more complaints before that fire occurred. And why this is an environmental justice issue is because, first, the people living in that area are communities of color. And 36% of that population live below the poverty line. So there is a racial and economic implication with regards to what that community has been exposed to. And also, despite their complaints over many years, there was not really any change or care expressed to reduce their risk to some of the incidents that they've been seeing in their community. And further, in addition to the demographics of that community, within 3 miles, we have 12 public housing buildings in that community, 2 of which are subsidized housing that are federally funded. So when we think about social groups and what it means to be a minority in terms of your income, your race, your origin, there is an implication in terms of where you're likely to be living and how unsafe and unhealthy that environment could be. All right, next slide. So now we're going into a third branch, if I could say, but when we talk about climate justice, there's an economic implication. When we're talking about environmental justice, there's also an economic implication. So for example, if from a climate perspective, if you live in an area that is severely affected by hurricanes, but your community or your region does not really contribute to greenhouse gas emission, when there's a hurricane, you're likely will have to be displaced, and displacement has a cost to it. So you have to look for another housing, whether that housing be temporary or permanent. If it is temporary and you want to return to your home, if you didn't have any insurance, for example, there's a cost for rebuilding. If you have to be permanently displaced, that means you're likely to lose your job, and losing your job means you have to seek employment elsewhere. And there's no guarantee that you'll find something that will allow you to afford living in that new geography. When we're talking about environmental justice and economic justice, if you live in an environment that is polluted and that level of pollution jeopardize your health, that means you could potentially see an increase in emergency room visits. And if you have to go to the emergency room, whether it be you or a child, that means you have to take off work, right? So you're losing money. you also have to pay for medical bills. So there's a financial implication related to that. But as a whole, when we're talking about economic justice, is everyone has the right to a living wage. Everyone has the right to healthy housing, safe housing, education, healthcare, clean environment, food and healthy food, and safety in general. So if none of those are met, then there's an economic injustice issues. So what we're seeing is there are many organizations, groups, and government or institutions that are advocating to have protections for workers in industries so that they are not only protected, but they're also provided with the resources so that they can live and their well-being is safeguarded as well. And other areas that are being advocated for are the right to restored land. So if you had lost your land, ensuring that whether it be through reparation, that you're able to be reconnected to your land. You're also able to have access to clean air, clean water, and housing. So those are some examples when we're talking about economic justice. And next slide, please. So overall, when we're talking about the intersection, you know, from those different themes that I have covered, we should be looking at how we engage in spaces, how we engage in advocacy initiative by looking at issues from a social justice lens. Because if we're looking at social justice as the foundation for that we want to build upon, it gives us a clearer understanding of how ongoing issues have disproportionately affected different communities and therefore contributed to economic burden, environmental burden, and climatological burden. So therefore, we cannot be talking about one level of justice without recognizing and addressing those other levels of justice. Next slide. And I think this should be my last slide. So this is a framework, a framework that I have put together building on an environmental justice framework as a recommendation for us to explore or maybe follow or adapt to our strategies and initiatives around building an environment that is fair, that is inclusive, and that also promotes equitable outcomes for all. So if there are, with issues that are with systemic issues that we're seeing in society today, I would recommend that moving forward, we start with this base of this of this pyramid, being that we should recognize or learn about structural systems that have been put in place, leading or building or expanding the disparities that we're seeing. And also taking into account the cultural context, the historical context, and the different groups that we're talking about. Then from there, we move into what I call a procedural justice. So when we're talking about processes that are in place around advocacy initiatives, when we are, for example, advocating for specific policies, who is actually at the table to talk about those opportunities for creating policies that are protective, inclusive, and addressing the challenges that many have been dealing with in terms of dire needs. But once we create or pass those policies, we should also be talking about how are those policies going to be implemented? And how are those, let's say if a policy is to provide services to a specific group or a community, how accessible is it going to be for that community? So therefore, those solutions around addressing such justice issues should not be looked into in silo, but we should be aware of the interconnections between those different issues. Next slide. So that wraps up my presentation. I hope that you got some takeaways that will get you thinking. And my email address is here. I'm happy to connect with anyone interested in learning more about this presentation. And I'm also leaving the web address for our organization. Thank you. And Sam, I'm passing it over to you.
Thank you, Joanne. I'm going to take a moment to thank you, Joanne, and the CLEO Institute, as well as you, Teresa, and the P.E.E.R group for your words and your wisdom today. I appreciate it. Also, thank you to the Volo Foundation for helping to make this possible. My name is Sam, and I'm with Self-Help. So today I'm going to talk to you about a few things. One, who is self-help and what is our role in the community? Second, what is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, clean energy finance, and how does that relate to economic justice? And then finally, I'll give you some tips for avoiding predatory lending on clean energy projects here in the state of Florida. So let's start with who is self-help. So our mission, you can see on the top left there, is since 1980, self-help has been creating and protecting ownership and economic opportunity for all. Our services are open to anyone, but especially people of color, women, children, immigrants, rural residents, and low-wealth families and communities. Self-help is a certified CDFI. CDFI means Community Development Financial Institution. CDFIs are typically nonprofit and they're very mission-driven financial organizations that provide access to capital to communities that have been historically under-resourced or marginalized. In addition to being a CDFI, where self-help is also a minority depository institution and a low-income designated credit union. On the right, you'll see a chart of our organizations. Self-help is a family of nonprofit organizations, which includes 2 CDFI credit unions, Self-Help Credit Union and Self-Help Federal Credit Union, as well as on the left, Self-Help Ventures Fund, which is a CDFI loan fund, and Self-Help Climate Capital. And then finally, on the right-hand side, you can see self-help includes the nonprofit Center for Responsible Lending. And what CRL is an organization that advocates and educates to help protect consumers against predatory finance. So we try to help, we want to help advance people and improve their financial lives and help protect them from practices in the market that may be harmful. So you can see here, Self-Help is a national CDFI, and we have locations in 9 states. In Florida, we have locations in Jacksonville, Tallahassee, Central Florida, and South Florida. Over time, our locations will grow. Since 1980, Self-Help has lent more than $11 billion to borrowers, and more than half of that has been to minority borrowers. 82% of the loans we have made since 1980 have been to low-income borrowers. Now this chart, it's a list of programs and services that we offer. I'm going to go through it not because I'm trying to sell you on our services. I just want you to understand the context of who we are, because you'll see, when our work, when it comes to clean energy, how it's going to make a little more sense in terms of our mission. So in the top left, you'll see that we offer fair and inclusive financial services. So accounts and loans to individuals, small businesses, and nonprofits. In short, we don't rip people off. We try to be fair, don't overcharge people fees. We also offer credit building resources and financial counseling for folks to help people improve their credit, things like credit builder loans or a free FICO score review. We're also welcoming and inclusive, so we welcome new Americans, people with a social security number or an I-10. We also serve other folks who have been traditionally marginalized, people who have disabilities or people returning to society after being involved in the justice system, among others. Next column, you see that home ownership is a big part of our mission. So we believe that building wealth in families and building generational wealth is important. And the best way to do that is through home ownership. So, for example, we developed a first generation home buyer program to help families become homeowners and build equity over time. That was part of our racial wealth gap initiative, and we continually look for ways to help narrow the racial wealth gap in America. One of those ways that have been effective for us is our national indirect home mortgage program. So we provide home mortgages through other lenders to help low and moderate income families become homeowners. We've helped more than 50,000 families become homeowners in the United States. Next column, you see that we also do commercial real estate lending. So we do multifamily affordable housing. We lend for health centers in low-income neighborhoods, among other projects. We also manage affordable loan funds to help with affordable housing or help small businesses to get access to credit. And then finally, the bottom of that column, the third column, you'll see that we also do some real estate development. I'll share you one little quick story about our real estate development. Earlier this year, when Vice President Kamala Harris announced the winners or the awardees of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, she told a story, and that story was about self-help. And she was in Charlotte, and in Charlotte, there's a neighborhood. I think it's called Greer Heights, and the Greer Heights neighborhood is a historically black neighborhood, and self-help had built 49 single-family homes in that neighborhood, and all of those homes were highly energy efficient. We helped low and moderate income families buy those homes, provided them with mortgages to become homeowners, and most of those homeowners experienced extremely cheaper energy costs. So we were able to reduce their energy expenses in those homes. And so that's just an example of some of the real estate. We've also built, affordable housing and nonprofit centers, different projects. I already talked to you about the Center for Responsible Lending. And then lastly, you'll see that self-help does clean energy lending. So currently in our credit union offices, we offer electric vehicle loans. We also offer home energy saver loans to help people make their homes more energy efficient for things like insulation or stronger roofs or impact windows, obviously solar, things like that, energy efficient appliances. And then coming soon, we're also going to be able to offer some more enhanced residential solar loans in our offices as well. And then lastly, we're going to get into Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So what is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund? Well, 2 years ago, the federal government passed the Inflation Reduction Act. It did many things, but one of the things it did was provide funding for different clean energy projects. Some of that funding went to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and then the EPA used some of those funds to create the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund can be divided into 3 categories or 3 buckets. The first bucket is the National Clean Investment Fund. The second bucket is the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. And the third bucket is Solar for All. I'm not going to get into all of the details of these, but let me just point out that the programs work together to encourage clean energy financing across the U.S. to help finance more and better clean energy projects for families and for organizations across the U.S. Now, self-help is part of that first bucket. So under the NCIF, Climate United won $7 billion. Now, Climate United consists of self-help, Calvert Impact, and the Community Preservation Corporation. And those 3 organizations are going to deploy those $7 billion for a variety of different clean energy projects across the U.S. over the coming years and decade. And the whole purpose of this is to nurture and inspire more and more lenders, particularly community lenders, to loan for clean energy projects and to loan in a responsible way. And not only that, these funds are designed primarily for low and moderate income families. So the EPA requires that at least 40% of these funds be deployed to what they call LIDAC communities, stands for low income disadvantaged communities. So self-help and Climate United have taken on that challenge. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about how we're going to deploy those funds specifically. But real quick, Climate United is going to focus on three things. Electric vehicles, not only, um, you know, like single family passenger vehicles, but also fleets of vehicles, distributed energy generation, mostly solar, could be other types of energy generation that's clean. Green homes and buildings, so high energy efficient homes and buildings. Different market segments, consumer, single family, multifamily, community facilities, small business, schools, and minority serving institutions such as HBCUs, standalone generation. So this includes a pretty broad spectrum, but it can include single family homes or residential solar, nonprofit buildings, small businesses. Maybe a business is looking to finance the installation of 1,000 EV charging stations across Florida. Well, this program could potentially provide capital to a project like that, as well as to standalone projects such as a solar energy installation. And then finally on the right, this is a little complicated, but we're going to deploy these funds through three different approaches. One of them is through standardized products. Now, what that means is, in short, we'll be able to provide capital and standardized products to other lenders so that they can originate those products in communities, and then we'll buy those products and provide them additional capital so that they can originate more loans. We'll also, number two, provide direct investments into some community lenders. So this could include other CDFIs, maybe other credit unions. And then finally, we're going to provide finance and lending for qualified projects, directly into qualified projects. So if someone's looking to build a multifamily clean energy building, or if someone's looking to finance a fleet of electric buses, or if someone is just looking to finance a single family home and buy a home that is already energy efficient, we'll be able to, over time, hopefully invest funds into those projects. This shows you on the right how that works in a diagram form. So Climate United will provide capital directly to qualified projects, but also through community and green lenders to qualified projects. Bottom left, you see, not only are we've agreed not to deploy this money not only to 40% LIDAC, but actually to 60%. So Climate United has agreed that 60% of the capital we deploy over the next years will be to low-income disadvantaged communities, 20% to rural communities, and 10% to tribal communities across America. And by the way, LIDAC, there are several definitions for what that means, but the shorthand answer is communities at or below 80% area median income. The next two slides, one of them says, are you a lender? And the next slide says, are you a qualified project sponsor? I'm not going to go through the details, but if you're a lender or a project sponsor, this diagram shows you where to go, or who in Climate United is taking the lead on a particular type of lending or a particular type of project. So for example, single family consumer homes, or single family electric vehicles, residential individual electric vehicles. Self-help is going to take the lead on that, while CPC Climate Capital is going to take the lead on multifamily housing. So I'm not going to go through the details. You can freeze these screens and kind of see who's going to be taking the lead on those different types of projects. Now, self-help's initial focus is going to be deploy these standardized products, these indirect products, particularly on consumer clean energy loans. So what does that mean? Is that we're going to issue some RFPs, and different lenders across the U.S. will be able to respond and basically sign up to become originators of these types of loans: electric vehicles, residential solar, and green home mortgages, primarily for new construction. That's just phase one. There will be subsequent phases where we're going to roll out additional programs. We're also going to be doing our own direct lending, for things like commercial and different types of clean energy projects. So stay tuned and watch our websites for information about the RFP process. But also, just so you know, self-help is going to be advocating for consumers advocating to make sure these funds are distributed equitably, providing resources for lenders, and also trying to engage and educate the community. So as we talk about a just transition, transitioning our economy or transitioning from primarily fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy, a lot of people support that, but we also want to make sure that we're supporting it in an equitable way. So as we deploy this capital, whether it's through other lenders or directly, we want to make sure we do it in a responsible and inclusive way so that the energy transition will be equitable for families and low-income communities. So these funds over time should be able to help people lower their energy bills and their transportation costs, should provide health benefits, cleaner air in homes and buildings, protect against weather, and particularly for things like a green home mortgage. It can help people build equity over time, not only in their new home, but in a home that's energy efficient. So it should help to lower their energy bills and also increase the resale value of that home because it'll already be, energy efficient. There are other benefits for the green transition, but not the least of which is knowing that we're all working together to create a more sustainable future and to mitigate climate change and pollution. So now I'm going to change gears and talk a little bit about advocacy for consumers. So the Center for Responsible Lending recently issued a report. It's called the Shady Side of Solar System Financing. So you can read the report on our website. I'll give you our web links in just a second. But the report issues some warnings against predatory solar financing. So here's some of the key findings. What we found was that some elements of solar financing across the U.S. and sales techniques can be predatory. Solar financing agreements can potentially worsen a borrower's financial situation. Sometimes, families don't need another loan, or they certainly don't need a loan that's predatory or that's going to take advantage of them, where the interest rates or the fees are too high. Next bullet there says, the price of solar systems can often be much higher if someone finances a system. So this allows sellers to sometimes hide the true financing costs in the inflated price of the solar system. Solar debt can elevate the risk that consumers will lose their home to bankruptcy or foreclosure. So you can see why we're concerned about this. Is all solar lending bad? No, most of it's probably not. But we think, consumers should be aware, and not just consumers, but organizations, nonprofits, governments, local governments should all be aware of this because we need to protect people. We need to help each other. We want this clean energy transition to be good, not bad, to be equitable, and to help people, learn to adopt clean energy technologies. If unchecked, these harmful lending practices can undermine homeowners' long-term investments in clean energy. It can put families at risk of spending money on systems that fail to perform. It can increase rather than decrease their utility bills and put them at risk of losing their home. So I say all of this with a caveat. We're pro clean energy and pro clean energy projects and pro clean energy financing. We just believe it needs to be done in a responsible, fair, and inclusive way. The good news is there's already been some responses at federal, state, and local levels. I happen to be in Miami, and Miami-Dade County has passed some local regulation. The state of Florida has passed some regulation. And there's been some new discussions at the federal level for some increased protections on solar and clean energy financing. Our position right now is we believe these consumer protections, these recent ones are good steps in the right direction, but we also believe they're probably not enough. So, unfortunately, in the world we live in, there are people who operate honestly in ways that are good for people and good for families and good for economies. And unfortunately, there are some people who who don't operate that way. So sometimes we do need protection. We do need legal protection. That's why, for example, we have the Truth in Lending Act that all banks and credit unions have to comply with. So we want to help protect folks. And the best protection is educating yourself and others about the responsible use of credit and lending, educating yourself about clean energy systems and tax incentives as well. So here's a few tips for those of you in Florida. There are different options if you're either buying an electric vehicle or making an improvement in energy efficient improvements to your home or to your building. You can pay cash, you can pay financing. Both are valid. You can purchase, and sometimes leasing can be a very good alternative for families. Leasing can sometimes make things more affordable. Families should consider available grants and tax incentives. You can go to the irs.gov and learn more about different tax incentives, or email me. I'm happy to share information. In general, you should always be aware of the annual percentage rate and the total cost of borrowing when you get a loan. Be aware of if there are excessive or abusive fees, such as application fees, prepayment penalties, or high premiums for credit insurance. Be aware of the repayment terms. How many payments, how many years is this loan expected to last? Is there a balloon payment? You may have heard of PACE financing and UCC financing. These can be very good tools for some people, but we also encourage folks to proceed with caution because if, for example, a PACE loan that secures a tax lien against your property, if you don't know what you're getting into and the costs are too high for you, it can actually put you at risk for losing your home. So like anything else, shop around for your loan, consider alternatives. Remember that you're not required to go with the installer's financing. Educate yourself. That's sort of the golden rule. Here's some tips and resources for folks. On the left, I listed some folks in Florida who currently do clean energy financing. So obviously, Self-Help Credit Union, solar and energy loan funds. Those are our friends over there at Self. Two different organizations, by the way. Self-Help and Self are two different organizations, but they're great. And they're a great resource for solar or clean energy finance. Jetstream Credit Union, they do clean energy financing. They're located in Miami. Climate First Bank is another institution that does clean energy lending. I also mentioned here, you can always talk to your local credit union. In case you don't know, credit unions are not for profit. And most credit unions offer simple interest loans for personal loans, auto loans, home equity loans. They can help you understand credit, understand rates, and understand fees. I mean, you can even walk into a credit union with a financing agreement from another lender and ask them to give you their advice. They may be willing to help you understand what you're getting into. There's some national options listed there, and I didn't list different options that are available for commercial organizations and nonprofits, but feel free to reach out to me. There's a nonprofit called Solar United Neighbors, which can help you with understanding solar systems. They have a lot of information on their website. They can also give you a free phone consultation. So we encourage you to check them out. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, it's a federal agency. They have a lot of great resources on their website. Just go there and search for clean energy or for solar. You can also file a federal complaint if you feel someone's trying to take advantage of you. You can also do the same thing in the state of Florida with the Office of Financial Regulation. And then lastly, I list our website at Center for Responsible Lending, responsiblelending.org. So here's all of my contact information. My name is Sam Chesser at selfhelp.org. You can email me with any questions. Happy to help. Self-Help's main website is self-help.org. And then our coalition that is an awardee on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is weareclimateunited.org. If you go there, they have information. You can sign up to get our newsletter, read some FAQs. They have webinars. You can also fill out an intake form there. So particularly if you're a lender or if you have a clean energy project, a larger clean energy project maybe that you're looking to maybe finance on multifamily housing or some sort of commercial building, larger projects, definitely fill out that form at weareclimateunited.org and someone can help direct you to the right resources. And then lastly, I mentioned responsiblelending.org. That's where you can, learn more about how we advocate to help protect consumers. And that ends my presentation. Thank you all. I think I'm going to turn it back over to Teresa now for some questions. And yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Sam, for that very useful and very pertinent information right now as we're kind of going through the just transition in a sense, hopefully a just transition. I do have a couple of questions. First for Joanne, as you mentioned earlier, everything is kind of connected when we're talking about this social justice space. As you said, kind of branches of the same tree. And we've been discussing some facets of economic justice here. And you showed that wonderful pyramid of, right, maybe steps that we need to take and how to think about a just transition. What do you think are some of the concrete next steps that we might need to take for a just transition?
Thanks, Teresa. I think that's a really great question. I would say some of the preliminary step and concrete steps that we should consider. So first, when we talk about evaluation and planning, if a policy is being decided on and eventually passes, who is going to be held accountable for ensuring that it's properly implemented? But whatever that policy is, when it was being designed, we need to ensure that it's not going to exacerbate existing inequalities in communities, whether it be from a climate perspective or an environmental perspective or an economic perspective. And as those policies are being designed, whoever those policies are intended to benefit, ensuring that there's representation from those constituents to ensure that there is an opportunity for them to share their opinion on how to better formulate or shape those policies. But I also think as we're talking about just transition, society is changing and that change is happening at a fast pace. So when we talk about clean energy, sustainable energy, the workforce has to change to adapt, right, to those new infrastructures, technologies, and whatnot. So ensuring that when we're talking about workforce development, there is funding set aside to develop and provide training and education programs so that the existing workforce can upskill their skill set, but those who are entering the market for the first time can also learn those new skills so that they become more employable, if I could say. But within workforce development, I think we should also talk about gender equity, right? So when we talk about, when we think about who has mostly occupied positions that are currently being replaced by artificial intelligence, what kind of safety net are in place, or are we even thinking about that to ensure that that specific subgroup is not left behind? And when we think about positions such as cashiers at the grocery store, accountants, bank tellers, those are most likely going to be replaced by machines. So what are we going to do with that specific subgroup to ensure that we're not further exacerbating their economic burden?
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I didn't even really consider AI, right? And now we have this like new kind of system to consider as we're still kind of thinking about our old systemic issues. Incredibly fascinating. Sam, a question for you. You talked about some predatory lending practices that happen in the solar financing space. And I was wondering, and some tips to avoid it. But I was wondering if you could expand a bit more broadly on the connection between predatory lending and economic justice in general.
Yeah, that's a great question, Teresa. You came up with really good questions. Who are usually the users or if you want to say the targets of predatory lending. It's typically low-income families, low-wealth families, could be people in desperate situations. Often it is communities of color. And well, those people are the same people who are already disenfranchised. They're already under-resourced as a community, right? And so, we talked about the racial wealth gap. And let me just say, for example, like here's an example of what not to do. We're going to roll out green home mortgages nationwide to help people become homeowners, right? Well, you all know, back after World War II, the United States launched a program for homeownership in America and to encourage homeownership and financing for homeowners and there were some good things that came out of that, right? There were also some very bad things that came out of that. Historic redlining of entire neighborhoods based on race and ethnicity and other attributes. And there was already a racial wealth gap in America before that, but that made it even worse, right? And there's been other policies since then. Even today, there are stories of people putting their homes on the market and the same home will get appraised at different values based on whether the appraisal believes the current homeowners are white or black, right? So these are real issues that are economic. And so I think we have an opportunity here to do it right. We have an opportunity to invest in communities the right way, in a responsible way. Some people don't need a loan, right? Sometimes loans are bad for folks. They're not ready for a loan, right? Some people need a grant. Some people, people are in different financial situations. Some people need to understand credit so they can become a homeowner. But we want to meet people where they are, help people in the best way we can help them, and not force people into projects and financing that are not good for them financially, because the goal is to help improve people's financial lives and improve the climate and improve health and reduce energy bills, not to make things worse. So it's all tied together with justice.
Yeah, I think if that hasn't become clear through this presentation and the session, that it is all connected, right? It is all part of one big tree in a sense. Yeah, so tackling all of these injustices are necessary at the same time. Thank you both for discussing your important work and the connections with all of the environmental justice and economic justices in the United States. And that is the end of our webinar. Thank you for calling in and joining us here during Florida Climate Week.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.